Today, we're going to hear from one of the interns at the Center for World Indigenous Studies, Janna Lafferty. Janna Lafferty's academic and professional background is focused on socio-cultural and environmental histories in the United States. It's my pleasure to have Janna now present on cultural connections. Cultural connections for interns and for our graduate students at the Center for World Indigenous Studies is a required activity. Janna?
One reason I'm drawn to anthropology, despite some of its ongoing flaws, is that it doesn't take objectivity for granted. European colonizers kind of leveraged a power by asserting its own ways of knowing as universal. And in anthropology, this sort of line of thinking is problematized. And the notion of objectivity as sort of a universal way of talking about the world, where people are socialized to speak as if from nowhere and everywhere all at once, is problematic. And I align with critical feminist theorists who have submitted that maybe the idea of objectivity doesn't need to be abandoned, but it needs to be rethought. So Western science is not wrong per se, but needs to be provincialized and put in conversation with other ways of knowing. So what are my relationships? And what are the histories that have produced me? That is a really big question. And for now, I've approached this by exploring parts of my genealogy in relation to a set of broader social histories, together with intimate human experiences of my own ancestors. So I've put together a narrative that resonated with me. And you'll see in this exploration, I have focused on land, religion, cultures, food, and eating. And so I want to acknowledge that this is a history of how humans relate and also how humans and non-humans relate. This map shows the basic area from which my ancestors come. It's a mix of people that crossed this sea and struggled over land, and in the process mixed and changed culturally, but also maintained many cultural ideas and practices. So I've been able to trace a lot of my family history to this area, and specifically England and Northern England, and specifically Lancashire and also Denmark. So I became interested in Lancashire. That's an area where my mother's maiden name is connected. I'm going back to the 12th century. And this space came to be inhabited through a series of immigration, settlement, conquest, colonization by a mix of Celtic Britons, Romans, Saxons, Irish, Scandinavians, and the Norman French. So all kind of circumscribed in that area that I had in the previous map. Genealogically, I could only trace my ancestors as far back to about the 1700s to Lancashire. And at this time, it left kind of a Romanized British people who still spoke a Celtic dialect similar to Welsh, and that's reflected in place names in Lancashire. And then in the 5th century, that's when the Saxons come in. So Germanic tribes that changed culture and relationships to land in specific ways. So the Saxons created a kind of government comprised of shires, and smaller tribes coalesced into kingdoms. And this is where you see a culture where sort of stronger warriors would elevate themselves to the levels of kings, and there was kind of a king worship that we see in folklore around like figures like King Arthur. So I want to fast forward to industrialization and at the period of land enclosures, because this is such an important part of the story. Lancashire became a major manufacturing base for England, and this was the period of land enclosure. So land was becoming privatized. People were being pushed off the land. It was creating a huge landless class of people who were being pulled into now this sort of labor force for industrialization. And so there was this mass migration into Lancashire towns. And I think we all know a bit about what these factories were like. Dismal, unregulated places, including, child labor exploitation. Also in East Lancashire, there were coal mines that literally fueled the Industrial Revolution. And this is where I pick up the actual story of my family members. My maternal grandfather's line were the Butterworths and the Fieldings. They clearly experienced the social effects of land enclosure and industrialization and early capitalist expansion, because I found out that 2 of my family members were child laborers. So one was working in the coal mines. He was a coal miner by the age of 8, and another was working, a girl was working in a velvet factory by the age of 6. So this photograph is not my own family photograph. It just documents coal miners of the period in England, and you can see that some of them are children. So here's the biggest and most pronounced storyline that I've heard about on my side of the family. My ancestors traveled to the US as very early Mormon converts. So as the Mormon LDS Church was forming, they very early on sent missionaries to England, started converting people, and my family members were converted, and in 1854 made the transatlantic journey to the US to gather with the saints, and otherwise the people creating this new religious community, the Mormons. They sailed from Liverpool to New Orleans and then ended up traveling north. And the idea was to go settle the Promised Land, the Great Lake Basin, Salt Lake Basin in Utah. These are pictures of my relatives in their older age, the ones that made this journey. Edmund Butterworth and Alice Fielding Butterworth. He was in his 20s and she was barely a teenager during that time. And then these are my maternal grandmother's ancestors, who actually come from Denmark, and I'll pick up their story a little bit later. But they were also converts to Mormonism. So this is the route that Edmund and Alice and their families took once they arrived to New Orleans. They sailed up the Mississippi to St. Louis, Missouri, and that's where wagon caravans were organized to walk west for several months across the plains. My family members, some of them died on the boat to the U.S. When they arrived in New Orleans, there was a cholera outbreak. Other family members died crossing the plains, babies, mothers, and children. And some of my family members were victims of stampedes, because I guess cattle would sometimes stampede and people would get stuck under horses or cows or the wagons. So a little bit about food. The Mormon pioneers, they brought their traditions with them to a new environment. They had to make do with what they found along the plains and in Utah to approximate ingredients and recipes that they cherished, and they dealt with homesickness by trying to recreate familiar recipes using new sort of resources. Cooking on the trail was the role of women. They would set up campfires twice a day and they would feed everyone in their company. So I guess gravy and sourdough were major food staples, and then whatever they could find. So wild game, fish, turtles, fruit. My grandfather always talked a lot about droughts in the early settlement period when they first arrived to the Salt Lake Basin, and also infestation that ruined agricultural crops. So there were periods of, again, more hardship, hunger, and small famines. The desert was a new environment to these people who were trying to recreate agricultural practices from the East Coast or from England. And so, so Mormons built dams because that was one way to reproduce this kind of agriculture. So they definitely were part of changing the landscape. This is Edmund Butterworth again in front of a store he built, and a garden that they subsisted on and also sold produce. Alice was the one who attended the store. Mormons were prohibited from drinking alcohol or caffeine. I definitely remember that early in my household. There was no alcohol or coffee drinking or soda with caffeine when I was a kid. This picture on the right I had to include because it reminds me so much of my grandparents' basement. Mormons were huge on food storage, and this was part of not just food storage just in case like the rapture happened, but Mormons had developed this culture of preparation in case of what my grandmother would call a rainy day. So any sort of disaster, they wanted to be prepared with food storage, for instance. And that is what my grandparents' basement looked like, that stockpile of food. This is an interesting part of my history. So my grandmother's line from Denmark had a different kind of experience. When they reached Salt Lake City, they were told they couldn't stay and they had to go settle a different part of Utah. That was where there weren't very many people, food and water were very scarce, and they became kind of resentful and skeptical of the Mormon church. They were taken in by another church who built schools, and this line of skepticism you can really see down into my grandmother and my mother. And my grandmother, unlike my grandfather, always had this kind of skepticism and was very curious in other cultures, other philosophies, and other religions in a way that, for instance, my grandfather was not. So these images are of my grandmother and my grandmother's family. These are my grandparents, and just quickly, so my grandfather was kind, gentle, intelligent, humble, and writerly. My grandmother was a stay-at-home mom, of course, like the culture of the time, but she was also a voracious reader, sharp-witted, curious about other religions and cultures. Around the time my parents were married, I think represents another shift, and one really marked by new disconnections and new fragmentations. There's kind of a new economy in the US, and people were increasingly moving further away from their hometowns to find work. And my father definitely had to do that. They moved around and then eventually settled down in Connecticut, which is where I was born and grew up. So moving away from Utah and this Utah connection, and then my parents ended up divorcing, and then eventually my parents both ended up leaving the church after this long history of association with Mormonism. At that time, my mom had to go to work and become a single mother, and she had to avail herself of this new environment of processed and fast foods to work all day and support 3 children, which people at the time, of course, didn't know was unhealthy. So I didn't eat the healthy food that my grandparents ate. I grew up on this kind of very processed, very fast food diet. And so just to make a few brief closing remarks, this work has made me feel a remembering and a sense of connection, but also makes me feel like I inherited a number of struggles and paradoxes that I am continuing to work out in so many ways. One is my personal journey to be healthy and understand what real food is again. And that's also part of my academic adventure of trying to understand food systems and US history and settler colonialism and cultural and environmental politics. There are all kinds of paradoxes here of bringing old traditions to new lands, cultivating important relationships to land, even as that means dispossessing other people of their relationship to land, and changing the environment in a way that disrupts other people's and other creatures' relationships to the land. So I feel on one hand I've inherited a responsibility to better navigate these questions and issues, while I also need to remember how my ancestors related to the land, find ways to grapple with all of this movement and disconnection, while at the same time kind of feeling more whole by embracing and remembering some of these relationships, including spiritual relationships with nature. And so I hope I haven't gone over too much, and I will end it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Janna. It's really quite a pleasure to see the story that reaches back so deep into history, and then you bring it all the way up to this moment that we're looking at you. You carry quite a lot on your shoulders. Janna, thank you so much. Intern for the Center for World Indigenous, who herself studies in her doctoral program at Florida International University in the Department of Global and Social cultural studies with a concentration in food studies and cultural geography. Janna, thank you so much. This has been another dialogue. Goodbye.